Welcome to part 2 of SPAN's 3-part series titled What Every Parent Needs to Know About Early Reading. SPAN's mission is to empower and support families and inform and involve professionals interested in the healthy development and education of children and youth. The New Jersey Tiered System of Supports for Early Reading project at SPAN is about increasing parent understanding of science-based reading instruction and intervention so that they can better partner with their child's teachers. NJTSS-ER is a partnership between the New Jersey Department of Education and SPAN, the statewide parent advocacy network. At our first session in this series, we learned about the New Jersey Tiered System of Supports Early Reading Framework that builds on New Jersey's current intervention and referral services regulations, calling for the conscious coordination of all school and district level supports and resources to specifically target the early reading needs of all students, including those with disabilities. To review, NJTSS-ER is a framework of tiered early reading supports that rely on a continuous cycle of data-informed instructional decision-making, in which early reading proficiency data is collected for all kindergarten through 3rd grade students through the administration of a universal screening assessment. These data are then used to determine the extent to which core reading instruction in Tier 1 in the general education classroom is enabling all students to meet grade level benchmark expectations, and to identify which students may benefit from additional Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention support to close their skill gaps. Students who are shown to be meeting grade level benchmark expectations on the universal screening will continue to receive Tier 1 core reading instruction with their progress monitored through ongoing curriculum embedded assessments that check for growth in grade level skill mastery. For students who did not yet reach benchmark expectations on universal screening early reading indicators, a diagnostic skill inventory will be administered to determine which specific skills to target for intervention. With these data, supplementary interventions are planned and then implemented, and ongoing progress monitoring assessments are administered to determine student progress toward individual goals and the overall effectiveness of the intervention. In the last session, we met first grader Tariq and talked a bit about his family's experience in a school that was implementing NJTSS-ER. Specifically, we discussed what his family learned about his school's approach to universal screening. If you missed that first session, we recommend you watch the recording in order to learn more about this essential component of early reading assessment. Tariq's universal screening showed that even though he was receiving research-based early reading instruction in Tier 1, he was not yet meeting grade level benchmark expectations in the area of phonics and early decoding skills. And that meant that without additional support, he would be left at risk for future reading difficulties. Fortunately, Tariq's school had prepared his family members to understand what these data meant in terms of his reading skill development. At a family literacy night presentation, very similar to what you're experiencing here in this presentation, they learned about the simple view of reading, a theory developed by reading researchers to model the basic components of reading development. The simple view of reading is, at its core, a simple mathematical formula. When a student's word recognition skills, shown here in red, are multiplied by their language comprehension performance, shown in blue, the product is their reading comprehension proficiency, shown in yellow. So let's explore. Let's factor varying degrees of word recognition and language comprehension skills into this model to see if we can predict reading outcome in comprehension. If the student has good word recognition skills and good language comprehension, the math tells us we can assume that good reading comprehension will follow. If the student has good word recognition skills but poor language comprehension, then we can predict that these language difficulties will likely result in reading comprehension problems, even though the student can recognize the words on the page. Now let's think about the opposite reading profile. What if the student has poor word recognition skills, meaning they have difficulty reading the words on the page, but if they listen to the passage read out loud, they can make all the needed connections for understanding. These children will also have difficulty reaching reading comprehension proficiency. And finally, a student showing both poor word recognition and poor language comprehension will experience difficulties with reading comprehension due to trouble with both of these factors. The simple view of reading is a fundamental theory. It sets the stage for thinking about effective reading instruction. While this formula itself may be labeled simple, truth be told, the two factors, word recognition and language comprehension, are quite complex and multifaceted. Now let's take a deeper look at the many skills that comprise each of these factors, word recognition and language comprehension. A researcher named Hollis Scarborough developed an illustration called the reading rope, specifically with parents and families in mind. It provides details about the skills needed to develop strong reading comprehension proficiency. Each strand of the rope represents a set of component skills aligned to the important instructional components outlined in reading research. To provide a quick overview, Dr. Scarborough shows how word recognition skills, the bottom strands of phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition, need to become increasingly automatic over time. While language comprehension, the top strands, including things like background knowledge, vocabulary, inferencing skills, etc., need to become increasingly strategic over time. Okay, let's explore the bottom strands of the reading rope related to the building block skills for word recognition. Phonological awareness is a class of skills that involve attending to, thinking about, and intentionally manipulating the units of spoken language. Specifically, we're talking about the internal parts of words. Young children will begin with general word awareness skills. They may track the words in a sentence, or they may recognize rhyming words and alliteration in familiar stories and nursery rhymes. And as they get more oral language exposure and wordplay experiences, their phonological sensitivity will progress and they'll be recognizing and manipulating smaller and more discrete units of spoken language. These may be syllables or onsets and rhymes. And finally, and most importantly, it will develop their phonemic awareness. Phoneme awareness or phonemic awareness is the skill most connected to learning to read. It involves attending to, thinking about, and intentionally manipulating the smallest individual units of a word. These individual speech units or speech sounds are called phonemes. Here are some examples of phonemic awareness tasks to give you an idea. So, what's the first sound in the word soap? So to answer that, you have to be aware that you can identify that first sound is S. If I asked you, what word do these sounds make when you blend them together? S, T, E, M. You will be able to blend those sounds into the word steam. And then finally, how about if I asked you how many sounds are in the word shop? You would need to segment that word shop into its individual sounds to know that there are 3. Shop. While strong phonological awareness is a necessary building block skill, it is not enough to guarantee reading success by itself. The next skill we'll explore in the word recognition strand is decoding. Decoding skills require alphabet knowledge. This refers to a child's ability to name letters, distinguish letter shapes, and to identify letter sounds. The goal of alphabet instruction is to develop students' ability to recognize and name letters so that ultimately students will be able to link sounds to those letters. And then with even more practice, they'll begin to understand how those letters relate to the sounds that they hear in words. This is the foundation for something called the alphabetic principle. The alphabetic principle is the understanding or the insight that written words and syllables are made up of letters and letter combinations that represent the spoken sounds that we hear. Conceptually, students begin to understand that there are connections between the phonemes they recognize in words and their growing alphabet knowledge. This is the basis of early phonics instruction. Phonics is a method of instruction that teaches students correspondences between the sounds or the phonemes in spoken language and the letters or the graphemes in written language. It's a method for instructing students how to use those letter-sound correspondences to read and spell words. For example, to decode the word soap, students must know that the S represents the phoneme S. The OA in the middle represents the sound O, and the P represents P. And then blending those sounds together, they can read the word soap. The last skill in the word recognition strand of the reading rope is sight recognition. This means the instant and effortless recall of familiar words. This term is not to be confused with those popular lists of high-frequency words that a classroom teacher may send home and refer to them as sight words. See, actually, every word that a reader encounters, whether it's phonetically regular, meaning it can be easily decoded, or whether it's irregular, meaning it's more challenging to sound out the word. Ultimately, all of these words need to be recognized instantly. In other words, readers need to eventually move beyond decoding words or sounding out words. They have to begin to just recognize those words on sight. The goal for instruction for these word recognition skills is to become increasingly automatic in your decoding over time so that we are recognizing words on sight. As students are building these lower strand skills, they should also be provided lots of rich read-alouds, storytelling, and classroom discussions to support their simultaneous language comprehension development. Providing students with lots of exposure to new background knowledge, vocabulary words, and sentence structures. The upper strands of the reading rope represent multiple elements related to comprehending both spoken and written language. The goal for instruction is for students to become more strategic in their use of these skills over time in order to apply them when they are trying to gain meaning from printed text. Background knowledge is all of the previous facts, concepts, beliefs, and experiences that we as readers bring to the table when we are reading a particular text. It is sometimes called prior knowledge, and it allows readers to make strategic inferences about the author's meaning without a lot of extra effort. It's the Velcro to which new knowledge sticks, providing the familiarity that is crucial for making connections and creating new learning. So for example, imagine if I asked you to read a short passage about the Victorian era. Would you know enough about Victorian fashion to know what the descriptions of the characters' clothing details might tell you about their social status? For example, what can I assume about a man who's described as wearing a velvet waistcoat? Next, vocabulary. Vocabulary is the knowledge of the meaning of words in a text, and just like background knowledge, it is a prominent predictor of reading comprehension. The more deeply a reader knows a word, the more likely it will be understood when it is heard or when it is read. Breadth, depth, and precision all come into play. How many words do readers recognize? How deeply do they understand those words? And how precisely can they use those words? All of that is vocabulary. So now think about the word run. How many different definitions can you come up with? Well, let's see. We could run a race. We could run a political campaign. We could get a run in our stocking. I can hear a car engine run. There are so many multiple meanings that would be really important for students to understand, even from just that one simple word. Next, we're talking about language structure. This is the relationship between the words and sentences in a text. Two things play a role here, something called semantics and syntax. Semantics refers to grasping what a text means by understanding the relationships that exist between the words, phrases, and sentences. It's different from vocabulary because it extends beyond just the meaning of individual words, and it sort of helps to clarify the content. So for example, if we read about a character who was going on a picnic by the river with some friends, and that character says, "I'm going to run down to the bank," we'll know because of semantic knowledge that he is running to the water side, right? To the edge of that river. And he's not leaving the picnic to go visit a financial institution. Syntax is actually a little different. That is the rules of the arrangement of words within sentences and phrases, and it's commonly referred to as grammar. So understanding how words are combined and ordered to form sentences and phrases enables better comprehension of a text. So I want you to think about this. Say we were reading a poem in a book, right? And think about this. "Through the sky the bird flew." That's a little bit more of a challenging syntactical structure than if I were to just be speaking and I said something like, "The bird flew through the sky." So helping students understand how syntax operates is really, really helpful. Verbal reasoning is the ability to comprehend, reason, and problem solve using concepts that are expressed through words. So it will include abilities such as making inferences, understanding metaphors or other literacy or figurative language structures, sequencing, making predictions. And finally, literacy knowledge is an understanding of how the text is organized and for what purpose. It includes knowledge of early print concepts, such as the difference between letters and words and punctuation, and also the directionality that we use when we're reading. It also refers to knowledge of various text structures or genres and knowing what reading strategies you need to use for different types of text structures. So for example, it would be important for a student to understand how to make meaning from a narrative story that progresses in a linear fashion, right? So the beginning, the middle, and the end. But it's also important to understand how to make meaning when a text is structured in a way that's intended to make a comparison or to contrast two things or two different concepts. So finally, when we look at this whole reading rope, we can talk about this idea of fluency. Fluency is defined as the ability to read text with accuracy, automaticity, and with proper expression. Accuracy would mean decoding words correctly. Automaticity would mean that your word recognition is automatic, right? We're operating at that level of sight recognition. This really means that we do not have to decode every word that we come upon. We are reading words with enough accuracy and with enough automaticity that we are now reading with a good reading rate. But this is not just all about speed, okay? Because speed alone does not encompass all there is to fluency. There is another component, and that's expression. This includes reading with the appropriate intonation, right? We're phrasing things properly. We're sort of reading with the emotions that are needed. And these types of things rely very heavily on the upper strands of the rope. So researchers have theorized that all readers have a limited amount of attention or cognition for the task of reading. So if a student's word recognition skills are not automatic, attention cannot be allocated to comprehension. Thus, their comprehension will be compromised. Think about that simple view here. If a student's word recognition skills are automatic, but they have limited background knowledge or limited vocabulary knowledge that relates to the passage that they're reading, here we might also see that their comprehension is compromised. So therefore, we can think about fluency as this important bridge between language comprehension and word recognition, okay? Fluency, if we're looking at this rope, is really the braiding and the twisting that we see in the rope. The lower strand skills become more automatic over time. They're getting braided together, and the upper strands are being used more strategically over time. They're twisting together. And then as we see those word recognition and language comprehension skills becoming more twisted and intertwined over time, this is where we start to see the development of fluent, skilled reading that allows students to comprehend a text very well. So with knowledge of this reading rope, and knowing that Tariq has shown difficulty reading or sounding out words on his universal screener, his parents understood that he was experiencing difficulties in the foundational decoding skills. At his parent-teacher conference in early November, Tariq's teacher also shared the results of his phonics diagnostic inventory. This showed that he needed intervention support in the area of letter sound knowledge. He needed some extra support in learning and using letter sound correspondences for reading and spelling words. So his teacher and his interventionist developed an intervention plan that focused on these specific phonics and decoding skills. His teacher explained that supports would be intensified across all tiers. This meant that his Tier 1 instruction would be differentiated to include more monitoring and feedback to support his specific areas of need, and that supplemental Tier 2 support would also be provided to him in an additional small group intervention session for 30 minutes a day. And this intervention session was going to include more explicit instruction, more modeling, lots more practice, and he'd be getting very specific feedback on those letter sound correspondences and decoding skills that were specifically needed for his intervention goals. His family was also assured that his progress would be monitored, and if needed, more intensive supports would be provided in Tier 3 if that was needed in order to close his skill gaps. There are actually 7 dimensions of intensification that can be considered when a child like Tariq needs Tier 2 or Tier 3 reading intervention supports. First, it's important that the core reading program delivered in Tier 1 is aligned with evidence-based practices to build skills in all of the areas we just discussed in our reading rope review. Supplementary intervention programs and instructional practices should also show the same evidence of effectiveness for students with more intensive skill needs. Through NJTSS-ER, district teams have access to analysis tools that can help them analyze the strength of their instruction and intervention materials. Next, it is important to ensure that the intervention provides a high dosage of opportunities for Tariq to practice skills while receiving timely corrective feedback. This means more opportunities to respond to prompts and receive that teacher feedback. Dosage can be increased by planning for a smaller group size, planning for more frequent intervention sessions per week, or by designing longer intervention sessions. Also, Tariq's interventionist can structure his lesson plans to include many more review or guided practice opportunities so that Tariq gets the repetitions and targeted feedback he needs to close his skill gaps. It's also critical that the intervention address Tariq's specific skill difficulties. Careful consideration of student grouping decisions based on diagnostic data is going to be needed to ensure that every student's intervention is targeted to their specific needs and that Tariq's time isn't misdirected towards extraneous skills. Another dimension to consider is attention to transfer. Tariq's intervention goals should be designed to focus on his transfer and generalization so that he can transfer the skills taught during his intervention sessions into the broader learning context throughout the school day and across content areas. And just like core instruction, interventions need to be comprehensive, adhering to the principles of explicit instruction across all areas of reading skill development that are identified. Many students with early reading difficulty may also display attention, motivation, and self-regulation difficulties that can affect their learning. That's not Tariq. But if it were, behavioral supports should be thoughtfully considered during intervention planning as decisions are made about the levels of intervention support, group size, and frequency and duration of intervention sessions. Finally, interventions for Tariq should be delivered within a validated, data-based process for systematically adjusting an intensive intervention over time to address Tariq's complex learning needs. This involves progress monitoring and data review that promotes instructional decision-making to ensure that Tariq is making progress that he needs to close his skill gaps. This process allows for timely decisions about identifying the need for additional support or for moving a student like Tariq into a more intensive individualized Tier 3 intervention if it was needed. This brings us to the end of our presentation today. The National Center for Improving Literacy has a few infographics that can be helpful for further understanding research-based reading instruction and the intensification framework that I just described in the previous slides. These infographics are available in the resource folder that accompanies this video recording. On the left, here's another infographic called Route to Reading, Avoid a Lemon, with tips from the National Center on Improving Literacy on how to spot questionable or ineffective practices. This infographic will also be in the resource folder. But based on the information in this graphic, we've prepared 3 questions that may be helpful as a parent who is seeking to communicate with your child's teacher about their reading instruction. You may ask, how does my child's core reading instruction address opportunities for both word recognition and language comprehension skill development? You can bring in that simple view of reading and ask how both of those factors are being attended to instructionally. You may also ask how you can support your child's growth in both of these skill areas at home. And finally, you should ask how you'll be involved in the process for developing an intensified, targeted intervention plan to address your child's skill needs if they are determined after universal screening. You should also ask how you'll be notified about your child's progress. Thank you for tuning in to this session. We hope it was informative. Educators, please check out the resources that are available at the New Jersey Tiered Systems of Support Early Reading website. And families, please check out the NJTSS-ER resources that are available through SPAN.